In less than a century, an empire born among herders of the inner Asian steppe expanded across a greater continuous stretch of land than any empire before or since. Its armies rode from the forests and grasslands north of China to the plains of Hungary, and from Korea toward the Middle East. They overthrew kingdoms that had existed for generations. They shattered armies that vastly outnumbered individual Mongol forces. They destroyed cities, redirected trade routes, displaced populations, and connected regions that had previously known one another only indirectly. Their expansion brought catastrophe to many of the societies that resisted them. Yet the political order that followed also moved merchants, technologies, officials, artisans, religious communities, and information across Eurasia on an extraordinary scale. The people who created this empire did not begin with the advantages usually associated with imperial power. They had no enormous urban population. They possessed no ancient bureaucracy comparable with that of China. They had no monumental capital from which a ruler could command millions. Their homeland was a severe landscape of grassland, mountain, forest, desert, and immense distances, where political authority could disappear almost as quickly as it had been created. And from that world emerged Temüjin, the man later proclaimed Genghis Khan. His story has accumulated so much legend that separating evidence from later tradition can be difficult. Medieval chroniclers wrote from different political, cultural, and religious perspectives. The secret history of the Mongols preserves traditions close to the ruling family, but is also a literary work concerned with memory and legitimacy. Persian historians such as Giovanni and Rashid al-Din recorded invaluable information while writing under Mongol rule. Chinese records, European travelers, Armenian and Georgian chroniclers, Muslim historians, and archaeological evidence add other pieces. They do not always agree. So the history that emerges is more complicated than either the image of Genghis Khan as an almost supernatural conqueror or the opposite image of the Mongols as nothing more than an uncontrolled horde. The empire they created depended on organized violence of extraordinary severity. It also depended on intelligence, administration, diplomacy, logistics, political flexibility, and the systematic appropriation of skills from conquered societies. Understanding how those elements work together begins long before Temüjin became Genghis Khan. The Mongolian plateau of the 12th century was not an isolated wasteland. It stood beside some of the richest commercial and agricultural societies on Earth. To the south and southeast lay states controlling northern China. Farther west stretched the networks of Central Asia and the Silk Roads. Forest peoples lived to the north. Across the grasslands themselves moved pastoral communities whose livelihoods depended heavily on sheep, goats, horses, cattle, and in some regions camels. A pastoral nomadic society could not live in one place indefinitely. Families moved herds between seasonal pastures and water sources. Their homes could move with them. The round felt covered dwelling known today in Mongolian as a gur, and widely elsewhere as a yurt, was well suited to this existence. It could be dismantled, transported, and reconstructed. Mobility did not mean simplicity. Pastoral societies maintained complicated relationships of kinship, marriage, dependency, alliance, servitude, and aristocratic rank. Herds represented wealth, but political wealth was measured in people as much as animals. A successful leader needed relatives, companions, subordinate families, warriors, and allies. He also needed the ability to distribute captured livestock and other rewards. That structure made political life exceptionally fluid. A leader who repeatedly succeeded could attract followers from other groups. A leader who failed could lose them. Confederations could become powerful and then disintegrate. Marriage could unite competing families, while the abduction of a bride could produce a blood feud extending across generations. Raiding could provide livestock, captives, and prestige, but could also invite retaliation. The population of the plateau was divided among communities identified by names such as Mongol, Tatar, Merkit, Karite, Nayman, and Ongud, although these labels should not be imagined as fixed modern ethnic nationalities. Their composition and political affiliations could change. Mongolic and Turkic languages were spoken across the wider region, and communities borrowed from one another continuously. Religion was similarly varied. Many steppe peoples understood political and spiritual life through traditions involving Tungri, the eternal heaven, alongside earth, ancestral, and other spiritual powers. Shamans occupied important roles in ritual and mediation. Yet the steppe was already connected to the major religions of Eurasia. Some Karite and other Inner Asian elites followed the Church of the East, often called Nestorian Christianity in older sources. Buddhism had long circulated through Inner Asia. Islam was increasingly important farther west. This religious diversity would matter enormously when the Mongols conquered populations containing Muslims, Buddhists, Christians, Taoists, and others. The Mongols were also heirs to a much older political environment. Centuries before their rise, the Xiongnu had established a formidable steppe confederation north of China. Later, Turkic Khaganates ruled enormous territories. The Uyghur Khaganate created a sophisticated Inner Asian empire in the 8th and 9th centuries. None of these states was simply an earlier version of the Mongol Empire, but they demonstrated a recurring fact of Eurasian history. The steppe could produce powerful political formations capable of challenging wealthy sedentary states. Relations between nomads and agricultural empires were never simply a permanent war between two worlds. There was trade, there was diplomacy, there were tribute relationships, there were marriages and defections. Sedentary states sometimes recruited steppe warriors, while steppe rulers depended on agricultural societies for grain, textiles, metalwork, luxury goods, and other products difficult to obtain from pastoral production alone. There was also manipulation. By the 12th century, northern China was ruled by the Jin dynasty, founded by the Jurchens, a people from Manchuria who had defeated the Khitan Liao dynasty. The Jin government was deeply involved in affairs beyond its northern frontier. Like Chinese and Inner Asian governments before it, it could support one tribal coalition against another, grant titles, encourage divisions, and launch punitive expeditions. No single Mongol ruler controlled the entire plateau. Earlier leaders, including Kublai Khan and Ögedei, appear in Mongol tradition as important predecessors of Genghis Khan. Ögedei was reportedly captured by Tatars and delivered to the Jin, who executed him. The memory of such events remained politically potent generations later. Into this unstable world, probably around 1162, although the exact year remains disputed, a child named Temüjin was born near the Onan River. His father was Yasugei, a member of the Borjigin lineage and a politically significant warrior. His mother was Hülegü. The stories surrounding Temüjin's birth contain the kinds of signs later societies often attach to founders of empires. The secret history says he was born clutching a blood clot in his hand. Such details belong to the remembered and symbolic life of Genghis Khan, and they cannot be independently verified. The important historical point is that Temüjin entered a family with prestigious ancestry, but without anything resembling secure control over the Mongol world. His childhood demonstrated just how fragile status could be. When Temüjin was still young, Yasugei arranged a future marriage between him and Borte, the daughter of Day Sechin of the Anggerat. Marriage alliances were political arrangements as well as family relationships, and Borte would become one of the most consequential people in Temüjin's life. But before Temüjin could grow into his father's position, Yasugei died. According to Mongol tradition, Tatars poisoned him after he stopped at one of their feasts. Whatever the exact circumstances, the consequence was devastating. Yasugei's followers did not simply transfer their loyalty to his young son. Temüjin was a child, and leadership on the steppe required the ability to protect and reward followers immediately. The families who had once followed Yasugei abandoned Hülegü and her children. The episode is central to the Temüjin story because it exposed a fundamental weakness of the existing political order. Noble lineage could provide a claim to leadership, but ancestry without followers was almost meaningless. Hülegü's family survived in difficult circumstances, gathering wild foods, fishing, hunting small game, and maintaining what animals they retained. The secret history emphasizes these years as a period of extraordinary deprivation. It also records an episode revealing the violence within Temüjin's own household. Temüjin and his younger brother Khazar came into serious conflict with their older half-brother Bektar over the distribution of food and authority within the family. Temüjin and Khazar killed Bektar. This was not the behavior of an idealized hero. It was a lethal struggle within a family already struggling to survive. Hülegü reportedly condemned her sons for the killing. Other dangers followed. Temüjin was captured by the Teyichi, enemies or rivals connected to the wider Mongol world. The secret history describes him escaping confinement with assistance from sympathetic individuals. The details have the dramatic structure of an origin story, but they reveal a political reality that would remain important throughout his rise. Temüjin survived partly because individuals from outside his immediate lineage chose to help him. That pattern became one of the foundations of his power. Temüjin certainly understood lineage and aristocratic legitimacy. He never abolished hierarchy, and the later empire remained dominated by his dynasty. But he repeatedly elevated people whose usefulness and loyalty mattered more than their position in an older tribal aristocracy. One early companion traditionally associated with him was Borshu, who helped Temüjin recover stolen horses. Another was Jelm. Men such as these became part of the intensely personal network around Temüjin before he commanded an empire. The most famous relationship of his youth was with Jamuka. The two became Anda, usually translated as blood brothers or sworn brothers. In steppe political culture, such a bond could carry enormous significance. Temüjin and Jamuka were once close enough to cooperate as allies. Eventually, they became rivals for leadership of the Mongol world. Before that conflict reached its decisive stage, Temüjin renewed his marriage arrangement and married Borte. Soon afterward, the Merkits attacked. The raid was probably connected to an older feud. Years earlier, Yasugei had abducted Hülegü from a Merkit husband. The seizure of Borte can therefore be understood not as a random act, but within the cycle of marriage abduction and retaliation that shaped steppe politics. Borte was carried away. Temüjin could not rescue her with his own resources. He sought help from two powerful allies. One was Jamuka. The other was Togrul, ruler of the Karite, whom Temüjin approached through Togrul's earlier relationship with Yasujii. Together their forces attacked the Merkits and recovered Borte. The campaign changed Temüjin's political position. He had demonstrated his ability to call upon substantial allies. He had participated in a successful military operation. Followers increasingly gathered around him. Borte subsequently gave birth to Joki. Because his birth followed her captivity among the Merkits, uncertainty about Joki's biological paternity later became a source of bitter conflict among Temüjin's sons. Yet Genghis Khan recognized Joki as his son, and Joki's descendants became rulers of one of the most powerful branches of the Mongol world. Meanwhile, Temüjin's relationship with Jamuka deteriorated. The conflict was both personal and political. Later accounts often present Temüjin as the champion of merit against Jamuka's defense of traditional aristocracy. There is some truth behind this contrast, but it should not be exaggerated into a modern ideological contest. Both men operated within an aristocratic steppe society. What distinguished Temüjin was his exceptional willingness to reorganize relationships of loyalty and incorporate useful followers from outside established elite networks. By the late 1180s, according to the chronology traditionally reconstructed from the sources, their rivalry had become war. At the Battle of Dallin Balzhut, Jamuka defeated Temüjin. The secret history associates Jamuka's victory with spectacular cruelty toward captives, including the boiling of prisoners, although historians debate precisely how the passage should be interpreted. Regardless of the exact details, Jamuka's treatment of enemies became part of the tradition, explaining why some followers eventually preferred Temüjin. Temüjin survived defeat. That fact matters because his later rise can look inevitable when viewed backward from the creation of the Mongol Empire. It was not. He was defeated more than once. He lost followers. Alliances shifted against him. At various points, another leader could plausibly have emerged victorious. What Temüjin proved exceptionally capable of doing was recovering. He constructed loyalty through reward and discipline. Men who surrendered to him could sometimes find opportunity rather than extermination. Individuals who had demonstrated courage, even while fighting against him, could be recruited. One famous example is associated with the warrior later known as Jebe. According to the secret history, after a battle Temüjin asked who had shot the horse beneath him. A warrior admitted responsibility. Rather than executing him, Temüjin accepted him into his service and gave him the name Jebe, often understood in connection with an arrow or weapon. Whatever embellishment entered the story in its retelling, Jebe unquestionably became one of the great commanders of the Mongol conquests. Another was Subutai, who came from comparatively modest origins and rose through military service. These men did not succeed because Genghis Khan operated a modern meritocracy. His relatives remained enormously privileged. But compared with many of his rivals, Temüjin proved remarkably willing to distribute authority according to demonstrated usefulness and personal fidelity. At the same time, he could be extraordinarily ruthless toward groups he regarded as irreconcilable enemies. The Tatars were a major example. The Jin had at times used Temüjin and Togrul against the Tatars, revealing how complicated frontier politics remained. Temüjin destroyed Tatar power around 1202. Mongol tradition describes an order to kill Tatar males above a specified height, conventionally represented as the height of a cart axle. The precise scale and execution of that command cannot be reconstructed with certainty, but the defeat unquestionably broke the Tatars as an independent rival power. Relations with Togrul eventually collapsed as well. The Karaite ruler had been crucial to Temüjin's rise, but successful alliances could become dangerous once one partner grew too powerful. Political intrigue involving succession, marriage proposals, and competing factions deepened mistrust. By 1203, Temüjin and Togrul were at war. Temüjin initially suffered badly. Then he recovered again. The Karaite coalition was defeated, Togrul fled and was killed, and many of his people were incorporated into Temüjin's expanding political structure. The next great obstacle was the Nayman Confederation in western Mongolia. In 1204, Temüjin defeated the Nayman ruler Tayang Khan. Tayang died, while his son Kuklug escaped and eventually fled into Central Asia. Jamukha's coalition was collapsing. Jamukha himself was eventually captured and delivered to Temüjin by some of his own followers. The secret history says Temüjin executed the men who betrayed Jamukha because betrayal of one's own lord made them untrustworthy. Jamukha then rejected an offer to renew his old bond with Temüjin and asked for a noble death without the shedding of blood. How much of this final conversation is literary reconstruction cannot be known. Its significance is nevertheless clear. Mongol memory portrayed the confrontation not merely as the destruction of an enemy, but as the ending of an entire era of rivalry. By 1206, Temüjin had defeated or subordinated the major political competitors across the Mongolian plateau. An assembly, or Kurultai, met near the Onan River. There Temüjin received the title by which the world would remember him, Genghis Khan. In English, Genghis Khan. The exact original meaning of Chinggis remains debated. The familiar translation, universal ruler, is possible as an interpretation of its imperial significance, but it should not be treated as a certain literal translation. More important than the title was the transformation occurring around it. Genghis Khan did not simply place himself above the old tribes and leave everything else untouched. He reorganized the people he controlled. The army was structured through decimal units, conventionally described as groups of tens, hundreds, thousands, and 10,000s. The largest major field unit, the Temüjin, theoretically contained 10,000 men, though actual battlefield strength could vary. Decimal military organization had precedence among earlier steppe peoples, so Genghis Khan did not invent the concept from nothing. His achievement was using it systematically to restructure political loyalty. Families and warriors from different backgrounds could be distributed into new units. That weakened some older tribal networks. Commanders were responsible upward through a hierarchy ultimately leading to the Khan. An imperial guard, the Kashig, served around Genghis Khan. Membership was prestigious and politically important. The guard protected the ruler, but it also became a training ground and administrative institution. Men serving close to the Khan could later receive important military and governmental assignments. The new state was therefore being built through people rather than buildings. There was no need for marble ministries on the steppe. The ruler's household itself was an institution. Military organization doubled as social organization. Written decrees, seals, messengers, commanders, and household officials allowed authority to move with the court. Writing became increasingly important. The Mongols adopted the Uyghur script for writing Mongolian, traditionally associated with the captured Nayman official Tatatanga. Literate Uyghurs subsequently became indispensable to Mongol administration. This was a pattern that would repeat throughout the conquests. When the Mongols encountered a society possessing useful skills, they often took those skills into imperial service. Scribes were valuable. So were physicians. So were engineers, translators, accountants, astronomers, metalworkers, and craftsmen. The Mongols did not need to invent every mechanism of empire. They needed to identify what worked and move the people who understood it. Genghis Khan was also associated with a body of laws and commands later known as the Yasa or Yasa. Popular accounts sometimes describe the Yasa as though a complete Mongol legal code survives. It is not. Later writers preserve fragments, descriptions, and claims, often written decades after Genghis Khan. Some rules attributed to him may be authentic, while others may represent later practice. What can be said securely is that Genghis Khan issued binding decrees governing military discipline, political loyalty, distribution of booty, court practice, and other aspects of imperial life. Discipline mattered because Mongol tactics demanded it. The famous Mongol mounted archer was not simply an individual horseman galloping chaotically across a battlefield. Mongol warriors generally traveled with multiple horses, allowing them to change mounts and preserve mobility over extraordinary distances. Composite bows gave mounted archers formidable striking power. From childhood, many steppe men developed riding and archery skills that sedentary armies had to train deliberately. Yet skill alone does not explain the conquests. Command and control were crucial. Units needed to separate and reunite. They needed to retreat without turning a planned withdrawal into panic. They needed to maneuver over broad fronts while maintaining communication. They needed to coordinate forces that might approach an enemy from different directions after weeks of independent movement. One of the most effective techniques was the feigned retreat. A Mongol formation could appear to break, encouraging an enemy to pursue. If pursuit disrupted the enemy formation and stretched its supply or supporting units, Mongol forces could suddenly turn or lead the pursuers toward another waiting force. The tactic was old, but Mongol discipline allowed it to be executed on an enormous scale. Intelligence mattered just as much. Before major invasions, Mongol commanders questioned merchants, scouts, prisoners, and defectors. They studied roads, rivers, mountain passes, rivalries, defensive systems, and supply conditions. They also used terror strategically. The destruction of resisting cities was not merely uncontrolled bloodlust. Often it was deliberately publicized to influence the next city's decision. That does not make the massacres less devastating. It explains why violence could multiply Mongol power beyond the number of soldiers physically present. If one city resisted and suffered catastrophic destruction, another might surrender before a siege began. A surrendered city might be required to provide tribute, supplies, specialists, and troops, but its population had a better chance of surviving. The threat was unmistakable. Submit, and incorporation was possible. Resist, and the consequences could be extreme. With the plateau unified, this military and political system turned outward. The first important target was Western Xia, or Shixia, the Tangut-ruled state occupying the Gansu corridor and regions around the Ordos. Western Siam mattered strategically because it lay between the Mongols and richer Chinese territories while controlling important routes linking China and Central Asia. Mongol attacks began before 1209, but the major campaign of that year demonstrated both their ambition and their limitations. Cavalry could devastate countryside and defeat forces in the field. Walls were a different problem. The Mongols had not yet developed the enormous multinational siege apparatus they would later command. At the western Xia capital, Zhongxing, near modern Yinchuan, they reportedly attempted to manipulate waterworks in order to flood the city. The operation did not proceed as intended and may even have flooded Mongol positions. Still, military pressure forced the western Xia ruler to submit and provide tribute. Genghis Khan did not annex the entire kingdom immediately. That decision reveals a feature often lost in simplified accounts of Mongol conquest. The Mongols did not always destroy whatever they defeated. A subordinate ruler who paid tribute and provided strategic benefits could be more useful alive. Western Xia remained in existence, although increasingly trapped within the Mongol sphere. A much greater challenge stood to the southeast, the Jin dynasty. The Jin state controlled northern China, possessed fortified cities, large armies, enormous agricultural resources, and a bureaucracy vastly more developed than anything available on the Mongolian plateau. Genghis Khan's conflict with the Jin also carried political memory. The Jin had interfered in steppe affairs and had once treated Mongol leaders as troublesome frontier dependents. Now the balance of power had reversed. In 1211, Genghis Khan launched a major invasion. The Mongols crossed the frontier and attacked through several routes. The Jin could field huge numbers of soldiers, but numerical superiority on paper did not guarantee concentration at the right place. Their empire had long defensive lines, internal divisions, and cities separated by distances Mongol cavalry could cross with alarming speed. At Hülegü, in the fighting of 1211, Jin forces suffered a devastating defeat. The Mongols penetrated deeper. Rather than attacking every fortress immediately, they could bypass strong positions, devastate surrounding districts, cut communications, and return later. They also began systematically absorbing specialists in siege warfare. Chinese, Khitan, Jurchen, and other engineers entered Mongol service. The character of Mongol warfare changed. Stone-throwing machines, traction trebuchets, siege towers, mining techniques, incendiary weapons, and methods of blockade became increasingly important. This adaptability would eventually allow an army born on open grasslands to capture some of the greatest fortified cities in Eurasia. The Jin court faced mounting crisis. In 1214, it agreed to terms with the Mongols, providing tribute and a princess, among other concessions. Then the Jin emperor moved the capital south from Zhongdu, present-day Beijing, to Kaifeng. Genghis Khan interpreted the move as a breach or repudiation of the settlement. Varezumet. Zhongdu fell in 1215 after a prolonged siege and blockade. The city suffered terrible destruction. It is important, however, not to compress years of warfare into the idea that the Jin dynasty itself fell at this moment. It did not. The Jin state survived in northern China for nearly 2 more decades and would not finally be extinguished until 1234, 7 years after Genghis Khan's death. Genghis increasingly delegated operations in China. One of the commanders entrusted with enormous responsibility was Macaulay, a Jalair general whose loyalty and ability had carried him to the highest levels of the Mongol military. This delegation was essential. The empire was becoming too large for Genghis Khan to personally direct every theater. Then events in Central Asia redirected his attention dramatically westward. A Nayman prince whom the Mongols had defeated years before had never disappeared from the story. Kublai, son of Tayang Khan, fled west and eventually gained power within the Kara-Kaitai state in Central Asia. His rule alienated parts of the population, particularly Muslims in territories where his religious policies became oppressive. Genghis Khan sent Jebe against him. The Mongol campaign combined military pressure with a politically effective promise of religious freedom. Kublai fled and was killed around 1218. The conquest brought Mongol power directly against another enormous state, Khwarezm. The Khwarezmian Empire, ruled by Shah Muhammad II, extended across much of Iran and Central Asia. Cities such as Samarkand, Bokhara, Urgench, and Merv stood within a wealthy world of irrigated agriculture, scholarship, craft production, and international commerce. Genghis Khan initially had compelling reasons to trade rather than fight. His empire was already deeply involved in war against the Jin. Opening another enormous front carried risk. Commercial exchange with Khwarezm could enrich both states. A Mongol-sponsored caravan, therefore, traveled west. In 1218, it reached the frontier city of Ochur. There, the governor, Inalchuk, suspected the merchants of espionage. He arrested them. Most or all were killed and their property confiscated. Genghis Khan did not immediately invade. He sent envoys to Shah Muhammad demanding redress and punishment of the governor. The Shah refused. Accounts differ over exactly what happened to the delegation, but a Mongol envoy was killed and companions were humiliated. For Genghis Khan, the issue now went beyond lost merchants. The treatment of envoys challenged his authority and endangered the diplomatic system on which long-distance imperial dealings depended. He prepared for war. In 1219, Mongol armies descended upon the Khwarezmian Empire. The invasion is one of the clearest demonstrations of why Mongol warfare was so difficult to counter. Genghis Khan did not advance his entire army in a single visible mass. Forces divided. Columns moved across routes the defenders did not expect. The Khwarezmian Shah had dispersed substantial forces among fortified cities, in part because he did not completely trust his own commanders, and in part because he expected the walls to slow Mongol progress. That decision surrendered strategic initiative. The Mongols could isolate targets. Ochur resisted for months. When it finally fell, Inalchuk was captured and executed. Later tradition says molten silver was poured into his eyes and ears, but that famous detail is not securely supported by the earliest evidence and should not be repeated as established fact. From Ochur, the Mongol offensive widened. Genghis Khan led forces across the Kizilkum Desert toward Bokhara, appearing from a direction the defenders had not expected. Bokhara fell in 1220. A famous speech attributed to Genghis Khan has him declaring himself the punishment of God. The line is preserved by a Persian historian writing afterward and may reflect literary shaping rather than a verbatim transcript. The reality required no dramatic speech. The city had fallen. Samarkand came next. Shah Muhammad had concentrated a large garrison there, but numbers on the walls could not solve his empire's wider strategic breakdown. Mongol forces surrounded the city. Elements of the garrison resisted. Others surrendered. The city was taken. As in many Mongol conquests, the population's fate was not uniform. Soldiers who resisted could be killed. Craftsmen and specialists could be selected for deportation. Young men might be conscripted for military labor or used in subsequent operations. Others were enslaved, displaced, or killed. Medieval sources frequently give enormous casualty figures for Mongol sacks. Those numbers are often impossible to verify and sometimes exceed plausible urban populations. The uncertainty should not obscure the underlying reality. The destruction in parts of Central Asia and northeastern Iran was enormous. Shah Muhammad fled. Genghis Khan dispatched Jebe and Subutai in pursuit. The two generals chased him across Iran, but he escaped to an island in the Caspian Sea, where he died in late 1220 or early 1221. His death did not end resistance. His son Jalal al-Din Mang-Burni continued fighting. Meanwhile, the Mongols attacked more cities. Urgench, the wealthy Khwarezmian capital near the lower Amu Darya, presented an especially difficult problem. Its urban environment and surrounding waterways reduced some of the advantages of mounted warfare. The siege became brutal. The city was eventually captured and devastated. Again, later chroniclers supply casualty totals ranging into extraordinary numbers. Exact figures cannot be recovered, but archaeological and textual evidence confirms profound disruption across parts of the region. Merv, Nishapur, and other cities also suffered catastrophic Mongol attacks. The reasons for individual massacres differed. Some followed resistance. Some were retaliatory. At Nishapur, later tradition connected exceptional slaughter with the death of a son-in-law of Genghis Khan. What developed across the campaign was a system in which terror, punishment, conscription, and selective preservation operated together. The Mongols wanted submission. They also wanted useful people. Engineers were moved. Artisans were moved. Scribes were moved. Entire populations could be relocated according to imperial needs. The result was both destruction and forced integration on a continental scale. Genghis Khan eventually pursued Jalal al-Din toward the Indus. In 1221, Mongol forces defeated him near the river. Jalal al-Din escaped by plunging across the Indus, an escape that impressed even his enemies according to Persian accounts. Genghis Khan did not continue deeply into India. His armies instead began turning back towards Central Asia. But Jebe and Subutai were still far to the west. Their pursuit of Shah Muhammad had developed into something much larger. With permission to continue, the two generals moved through northern Iran toward the Caucasus. They fought Georgian forces. They encountered an extraordinary mixture of peoples around and beyond the mountains. To cross the Caucasus and emerge onto the steppe north of it, the Mongols had to negotiate or fight coalitions, including Alans and Kipchaks, also known as Cumans. According to the sources, the Mongols persuaded the Kipchaks to abandon their Alan allies by appealing to their shared steppe affinities and offering gifts. Once the coalition split, the Mongols defeated the Alans. Then they attacked the Kipchaks. For anyone negotiating with them, the lesson was severe. A temporary Mongol agreement did not necessarily imply a permanent alliance. Defeated Kipchaks fled west and sought help from the Rus princes. The Rus world was politically divided among principalities whose rulers were connected by dynastic ties, but frequently competed with one another. The arrival of an unfamiliar army from the east encouraged several princes to cooperate with the Kipchaks. In 1223, their combined forces advanced against the Mongols. Jebe and Subutai withdrew. The Rus coalition pursued. For days, the pursuit continued across the steppe. This was exactly the kind of situation in which Mongol operational discipline became lethal. At the Kalkar River, the Mongols turned. The coalition's formations had become extended and coordination among the princes was poor. The Mongol attack shattered them. Some Rus contingents were destroyed before others could fully support them. Several princes were killed. A notorious account says captured nobles were placed beneath boards while the Mongols feasted above them, allowing the prisoners to die without their blood being directly spilled. As with many dramatic details from medieval warfare, the descriptions vary, but the defeat itself was unquestionable. And then the Mongols left. They did not capture Kiev. They did not occupy Rus. They did not establish a permanent administration. The expedition had not been the full invasion that would come later. Jebe died around this period, under circumstances that remain uncertain. Subutai eventually returned east. He carried knowledge with him. The Mongols now understood more about the roads, rivers, peoples, rivalries, and military capabilities beyond the western steppe. That intelligence would wait for another generation to use it. Genghis Khan, meanwhile, returned from the Khwarezmian War at the head of an empire transformed beyond recognition. When he had been proclaimed in 1206, his core domain lay on the Mongolian plateau. Less than 2 decades later, his authority extended into northern China and across Central Asia. But Western Xia remained unfinished business. During the Khwarezmian campaign, Genghis Khan had expected support from the Tangut state and did not receive the level of cooperation he demanded. By 1226, he was determined to eliminate Western Xia as an independent power. The final campaign was devastating. Mongol forces attacked Tangut cities and agricultural regions systematically. The aging Genghis Khan remained with the campaign. At some point, he became seriously ill. The precise cause of his death is unknown. The secret history connects his final period with a fall from a horse during a hunt, but whether that injury caused his death cannot be established. Other later traditions propose illness, battle wounds, or sensational stories involving a Tangut princess. There is no reliable evidence allowing certainty. What is known is that in August 1227, Genghis Khan died. He was probably about 65 years old if the conventional birth date of 1162 is accepted. Western Xia fell at approximately the same time. Later sources describe extensive destruction and harsh reprisals against the Tangut ruling house. Some popular retellings claim that Genghis Khan completely exterminated the Tangut people and erased their civilization. That goes beyond the evidence. Tangut political power was destroyed, many communities suffered severely, and their independent state disappeared, but Tangut people and texts survived the conquest. Genghis Khan's body was carried back toward Mongolia. His burial place has never been conclusively identified. Tradition associates it with the sacred landscape around Burkhan Khaldun in the Kenai Mountains. Stories claiming that the funeral party murdered everyone it encountered, or that a river was diverted over the grave, are famous but belong largely to later legend. The absence of a known monumental tomb is appropriate in one sense. Genghis Khan's greatest monument was not constructed from stone. It was the political system he left behind. That system now faced the question that has destroyed countless empires. What happens when the founder dies? Genghis Khan had understood the danger. His sons by Borte were Joki, Chagatai, Ögedei, and Temüjin. Joki was the eldest, but the controversy surrounding the period of Borte's captivity never disappeared. Chagatai openly challenged Joki's suitability during discussions of succession. The hostility between the brothers made choosing either one dangerous. Joki also died shortly before Genghis Khan. The choice therefore fell on Ögedei. He was not necessarily the empire's greatest battlefield commander. That may have been part of his suitability. He was acceptable enough to competing branches of the family to serve as a compromise ruler. After Genghis Khan's death, Temüjin acted as regent while preparations were made for a Kurultai. In 1229, the assembly confirmed Ögedei as Great Khan. The empire's enemies might reasonably have expected expansion to slow. Instead, it accelerated. Ögedei benefited from institutions his father had built, but he also expanded them. The Mongol government became more bureaucratic. Karakorum developed as an imperial center in Mongolia. Administrative specialists from across Eurasia entered service. Most importantly for communication, the relay post system, commonly called the YAM, was expanded and regularized. Stations positioned along important routes maintained horses and supplies for authorized travelers. Imperial messengers carrying identification tablets could change exhausted mounts and continue. The system did not make distance disappear. It made an enormous empire governable enough for orders and information to move with remarkable speed. Ögedei also had unfinished wars to complete. The Jin dynasty still controlled territory in northern China. In 1230 and the years following, Mongol forces intensified their attacks. The campaign required operations on a scale far beyond traditional steppe warfare. Armies maneuvered through mountain corridors. Siege forces attacked fortified centers. Food and fodder had to support sustained campaigning. The Mongols coordinated with the Southern Song, which was itself an enemy of Jin and hoped to recover territory. Kaifeng endured siege and epidemic. The Jin court fled. In 1234, the last Jin emperor died as Mongol and Song forces finished destroying the dynasty. The Jin state was gone. The Southern Song would eventually discover that helping eliminate one northern enemy had strengthened another incomparably more dangerous one. But the Mongols did not immediately concentrate everything against the Song. At a major Kurultai in 1235, the imperial leadership approved campaigns in several directions. One would carry Mongol armies back toward the land Subutai had reconnoitered more than a decade earlier. The nominal leader of this western expedition was Batu, son of Joki. Batu represented the Jochid branch of Genghis Khan's dynasty. Alongside him rode other princes from the imperial family, and among the senior commanders was Subutai. The old reconnaissance had become preparation for conquest. The first major target was Volga, Bulgaria, a wealthy Muslim state centered around the Middle Volga. Mongol forces attacked in 1236. The Volga Bulgars were defeated, although resistance and regional upheaval continued. The armies then turned toward the Rus principalities. The people who had encountered Jebe and Subutai in 1223 had been given more than a decade of warning. They had not created a unified defense. In late 1237, the Mongols approached Ryazan. Demands were made. Submission was refused. The city was besieged and taken. The destruction was severe. Other centers followed. Kolomna fell. Moscow, then still far less important than it would later become, was captured. In early 1238, Vladimir was attacked. The northeastern Rus princes attempted to assemble forces. At the Battle of the Sit River, Mongol troops defeated the army of Grand Prince Yuri II, who was killed. The invasion did not mean every town was destroyed or every region occupied identically. Some settlements were bypassed. Novgorod was not taken. Weather, terrain, distance, operational priorities, and resistance all shaped Mongol decisions. The armies eventually moved south. In 1240, the campaign reached Kiev. Once one of the greatest political and religious centers of the Rus world, Kiev had already suffered from decades of internal political change, but it remained symbolically and strategically important. Mongol forces under Baghdad besieged it. The defenses were breached. The city was devastated. Archaeology confirms violent destruction, although, as elsewhere, medieval numerical claims about the dead should be treated cautiously. The road beyond the Rus lands was now open, and the Mongols were not simply moving west as one enormous group. The campaign of 1241 would reveal a level of strategic coordination that terrified Europe. One force moved toward Poland. The main forces moved toward Hungary. The objectives were connected. By attacking Poland and surrounding territories, the Mongols could prevent potential allies from reinforcing the Hungarian king. In Poland, Mongol troops defeated forces at engagements including Chmielnik and then confronted a coalition near Legnica in April 1241. Duke Henry II the Pious of Silesia led the European army. The exact composition of his force remains debated. Later tradition has sometimes exaggerated the involvement of Western military orders, but Polish and Silesian forces, knights, and other contingents certainly gathered against the invasion. They were defeated. Henry was killed. The Mongols did not need to occupy Poland permanently. Their western thrust had achieved its operational purpose while spreading confusion and preventing coordinated intervention. The decisive theater was Hungary. King Bela IV had reasons to understand the danger. Kipchak's fleeing Mongol expansion had entered Hungary, creating internal political tensions. Some Hungarian nobles suspected the newcomers rather than seeing them as potential allies against the approaching Mongols. The Mongol armies crossed the Carpathians. In April 1241, the main Hungarian force confronted them near the Sejo River at the Battle of Mohi. Batu and Subutai coordinated attacks from different directions. The Hungarians had established a fortified camp. Fighting around a bridge became intense. Mongol troops used missile fire and siege weapons against defenders, while Subutai maneuvered another force across the river. The Hungarian position became increasingly vulnerable. The Mongols encircled much of the army. What followed was a catastrophic defeat. Large parts of Hungary were exposed. For months, Mongol forces raided and occupied territory east of the Danube. In the winter of 1241 to 1242, when the river froze, troops crossed into western Hungary. European courts had reason to fear that the invasion might continue toward Austria, Bohemia, northern Italy, or the Holy Roman Empire. Then the Mongols withdrew. The traditional explanation is simple. Ögedei had died in Mongolia in December 1241. The princes therefore had to return for a Kurultai to elect his successor. His death unquestionably mattered, but historians debate whether it alone explains the withdrawal. Baghdad did not immediately travel all the way to Mongolia, and Mongol operations were also affected by political rivalries, military priorities, grazing conditions, resistance, and the challenges of holding the Hungarian plain. Environmental studies have added another possibility. A wet spring in 1242 may have made parts of the Hungarian landscape unusually marshy, reducing pasture and mobility. There was probably no single cause. What is certain is that the major invasion ended. Europe had survived the immediate crisis. The Ruslands had not escaped so easily. Batu established his power in the western steppe, creating the political order later commonly known as the Golden Horde. Rus princes were not all replaced by Mongol governors. Instead, many remained in power as tributary rulers. They traveled to the Khan's court for confirmation. They paid tribute. The Mongols intervened in succession disputes and punished defiance. This indirect system could extract resources without requiring Mongol administrators to govern every village. The consequences for northeastern Europe would last for centuries. Back at the center of the empire, Ögedei's death exposed another problem. Genghis Khan had established a dynasty. He had not created a succession mechanism capable of eliminating rivalry within that dynasty. A Kublai was supposed to choose the great Khan from the ruling family. In practice, elections depended on alliances, geography, personal ambition, and the political power of royal women as well as princes. Ögedei's widow, Temüjin Khan, became regent. She was no passive caretaker. For several years, she controlled imperial politics while maneuvering to secure the throne for her son Gayuk. Officials rose and fell. Factions competed. Major expansion slowed, but the empire itself continued functioning. In 1246, a Kublai elected Gayuk Great Khan. The gathering became an international event. Among those present was Giovanni de Pien del Carpine, a Franciscan friar sent east by Pope Innocent IV. Europe was trying to understand the power that had recently devastated Poland and Hungary. The papal mission carried appeals connected with peace and Christianity. The Mongol response operated from a completely different political assumption. Gayuk did not view himself as one ruler negotiating with an equal civilization. The ideology of Mongol Empire increasingly presented the Chinggisid ruler as the sovereign authorized by eternal heaven to rule the world. Foreign kings were therefore expected to submit. Gayuk's letter to the Pope demanded precisely that. The encounter reveals how dangerous misunderstandings between Mongol and European diplomacy could be. European rulers imagined negotiations between independent powers. The Mongol court often imagined submission to universal empire. Gayuk, however, had little time to impose his authority. His relationship with Batu was deeply hostile. As Gayuk moved west in 1248, perhaps preparing for a confrontation with the Jochid prince, he died. The cause is unknown. Rumors of poisoning circulated, as they often did around sudden royal deaths, but evidence is insufficient. The succession crisis returned. Gayuk's widow, Ogul Kamish, acted as regent. This time, Batu used his enormous influence to redirect the imperial throne away from Ögedei's descendants. His chosen candidate was Monk, son of Talyui and grandson of Genghis Khan. Monk had participated in the Western campaigns and commanded respect among important sections of the dynasty. In 1251, he was proclaimed Great Khan. Opponents challenged the legitimacy of the process. Some members of the Ögedei and Shagatade branches resisted. Monk responded decisively. Purges followed. Princes and officials associated with alleged plots against the new regime were removed, exiled, or executed. The violence consolidated Talyuid control of the central throne. For the moment, imperial unity was restored. Monk turned toward administration with an intensity matching his military ambitions. He ordered surveys and censuses in various parts of the empire. Taxation needed greater consistency. The growing burden imposed by competing princes and officials had become dangerous for subject populations and for the state itself. Monk attempted to regulate demands and strengthen central oversight. He also continued the long-standing Mongol practice of using specialists irrespective of ethnicity or religion. The imperial world contained Buddhist monks, Muslim administrators, Christian clergy, Chinese literati, Uyghur scribes, Armenian princes, Turkic soldiers, and countless other communities. Monk himself adhered to Mongol religious traditions, but permitted major religious communities to operate at court. William of Rubruck, a Franciscan who traveled to Monk's court in the 1250s, left one of the most remarkable eyewitness descriptions of Karakorum. His account describes a city far smaller than the great metropolises of China or the Islamic world, yet astonishingly cosmopolitan. There were religious buildings serving different communities. Foreign craftsmen worked there. Merchants arrived from distant countries. At the center stood a court receiving information and tribute from across Eurasia. The Mongol capital embodied a paradox. An empire founded by mobile pastoralists had created one of the world's greatest networks of urban and commercial connection without turning its heartland into another China or Persia. Monk now planned new offensives on two enormous fronts. He assigned the Eastern Campaign to his brother Kublai. Another brother, Hülegü, received command of an expedition toward Iran and the Middle East. The forces dispatched with Hülegü were substantial. His instructions included destroying the Nizari Ismaili strongholds of Iran and compelling regional powers, including the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad, to submit. The Nizari Ismailis are often remembered in Western literature as the Assassins, a label wrapped in centuries of hostile legend. They maintained a network of fortified mountain centers and had survived among larger hostile states, partly through diplomacy and selective political killings. Against the Mongols, that system failed. Hülegü's army brought overwhelming numbers and sophisticated siege technology. In 1256, the Nizari Imam Rukn al-Din Kersha surrendered. Alamut and other fortresses were occupied. The Nizari political state was effectively dismantled, though the religious community survived. Hülegü then focused on Baghdad. The Abbasid Caliphate had once ruled an enormous empire. By the 13th century, its direct political power was far smaller, but Baghdad remained one of the most prestigious cities in the Islamic world, and the caliph retained immense symbolic importance. The reigning caliph was al-Mustasim. Hülegü demanded submission. Negotiations failed. In early 1258, Mongol forces and their allies encircled Baghdad. The army attacking the city was not ethnically Mongol alone. It included troops and specialists drawn from across the expanding empire, including Christian contingents from the Caucasus and siege engineers with East Asian expertise. This was what the Mongol war machine had become. A military system born in Mongolia was now using the resources of one conquered civilization to defeat another thousands of kilometers away. Baghdad's defenses collapsed rapidly. The city surrendered in February 1258. Then came one of the most infamous sacks in medieval history. Large numbers of inhabitants were killed. Buildings were looted and destroyed. The caliph was executed. The exact death toll cannot be known, and medieval figures reaching into the hundreds of thousands are unreliable. The cultural catastrophe was nevertheless profound. Libraries and institutions suffered. The political Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad ended. One frequently repeated image claims that so many books were thrown into the Tigris that the river ran black with ink. It is a powerful symbol, but its literal details come from later tradition. Likewise, the famous House of Wisdom associated with Baghdad's earlier Abbasid intellectual golden age did not necessarily survive as the same functioning institution until 1258 in the form popular accounts often imagine. None of those corrections diminish what happened. A city that had served for centuries as one of the great centers of Islamic civilization had been violently conquered by an army arriving from the east. The political map of the Middle East changed immediately. Hülegü continued into Syria. Aleppo fell in 1260. Damascus submitted soon afterward. Mongol power appeared ready to push toward Egypt. Then news arrived from the east. Mongol Khan was dead. He had been campaigning personally against the Southern Song in China. In 1259, during operations in Sichuan, he died near Jiayu Fortress. Sources disagree about the cause. Disease, particularly dysentery or another epidemic illness, is plausible. Other traditions attribute his death to a projectile or wound. Certainty is impossible, but his death changed the direction of world history. Hülegü withdrew much of his main force from Syria, leaving a smaller army under Kitbuka. The Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt seized the opportunity. In September 1260, Mamluk forces met the Mongol detachment at Ain Jalut in Palestine. The Mamluks won. Kitbuka was captured and killed. Ain Jalut did not prove that Mongol armies had suddenly become weak, nor was it literally their first defeat anywhere. But it was strategically important. Mongol rule did not extend into Egypt. The Mamluks preserved their state and would remain major opponents of Hülegü's descendants. Meanwhile, an even greater crisis was beginning inside the Mongol dynasty. Mongol had died without establishing an uncontested successor. Two of his brothers possessed the resources to claim supreme authority. One was Erik Bok, based close to the traditional Mongol homeland and supported by many elites whose power remained rooted in the steppe. The other was Kublai, campaigning in China and commanding the resources of the empire's increasingly wealthy eastern territories. The dispute was about personal power, but it was also connected to a deeper transformation. The empire founded by Genghis Khan had become too large, too wealthy, and too culturally varied to remain exactly the political system created in 1206. Kublai had spent years working with Chinese advisors. He had governed agricultural populations. He had established administrative institutions designed for sedentary territories. He increasingly understood imperial power through both Mongol and Chinese political traditions. To some steppe aristocrats, that made him dangerous. Erik Bok offered an alternative centered more firmly on Mongolia. In 1260, Kublai's supporters assembled and proclaimed him Great Khan. A rival assembly proclaimed Erik Bok. There were now two Chinggisid brothers claiming the supreme title. For decades, Mongol armies had exploited divisions inside the states they invaded. Now the division was their own. The struggle that followed would not merely decide which brother occupied the highest position. It would expose whether an empire stretching from China toward Eastern Europe could still be governed as one political body. And when that conflict ended, the Mongol world would continue to expand, trade, govern, and fight, but it would never again possess quite the unity Genghis Khan had created on the banks of the Yonnan River. When Mongol Khan died in 1259, the Mongol Empire was approaching the greatest geographical reach it would ever achieve, Yet at the same moment, the political structure holding that enormous territory together was beginning to fracture. Monk had been one of the last great Khans whose authority was recognized with substantial force across most branches of the dynasty. His death created a question that could no longer be settled quietly. Who would inherit supreme power over an empire stretching from East Asia to the Western steppe? Two of Monk's brothers emerged as rivals. Erik Bok remained close to the Mongolian heartland in Karakorum, where many members of the traditional steppe aristocracy supported him. Kublai, by contrast, had spent years governing and campaigning in northern China. He had surrounded himself with Chinese and Central Asian administrators and had become increasingly familiar with the institutions required to govern an enormous sedentary population. The dispute was about the throne, but it also reflected two different centers of imperial gravity. The empire of Genghis Khan had been created on the Mongolian steppe. Kublai's power increasingly came from the agricultural wealth, cities, taxation systems, and population of China. In 1260, Kublai's supporters assembled and proclaimed him Great Khan. Erik Bok's supporters held another assembly and proclaimed their candidate. There were now two brothers claiming supreme authority. Civil war followed. Kublai possessed a decisive long-term advantage. Northern China could supply grain, money, manufactured goods, soldiers, and administrative support on a scale the Mongolian heartland could not match. Erik Bok controlled strategically important territory and had influential supporters, but maintaining armies required more than prestige. Kublai gradually restricted his rivals' access to supplies. Alliances shifted. Fighting intersected with conflicts among Chinggisid princes in Central Asia. Famine and shortages weakened Erik Bok's position. In 1264, he surrendered. Kublai had won the struggle for the title of Great Khan, but he had not restored the political world of Genghis Khan. The irony was profound. Kublai won the civil war, just as the position he had fought to possess was losing its ability to command the entire Mongol world. Other descendants of Genghis Khan were becoming rulers of states powerful enough to pursue their own interests. In Iran, Hülegü had created what became known as the Ilkhanate. In the western steppe, the descendants of Jochi controlled a realm later called the Golden Horde. Central Asia remained divided among descendants of Chagatai and competing Chinggisid factions. These princes still belonged to the same imperial family. They remembered the authority of Genghis Khan. They maintained diplomatic and commercial relationships with one another. But family did not prevent war. The conflict between Hülegü and Berk made this unmistakable. Berk, ruler within the Jochid Western realm, had converted to Islam. He also had serious territorial disputes with Hülegü around the Caucasus. Hülegü's destruction of Baghdad added a further source of hostility. By the early 1260s, forces belonging to two branches of Genghis Khan's family were fighting each other. Berk even established relations with the Mamluks of Egypt, the same power that had defeated a Mongol force at Ain Jalut. An empire that had once exploited divisions among its enemies now contained divisions of its own. Kublai therefore concentrated on the region where his authority could be made real rather than ceremonial. China. The southern Song dynasty remained unconquered. This was no minor surviving kingdom. Southern China contained some of the wealthiest and most densely populated regions in the world. Its cities were enormous. Its agricultural economy produced immense quantities of rice. Its merchants were active throughout maritime Asia. Its government possessed a sophisticated bureaucracy, while its armies defended a landscape filled with rivers, fortified cities, mountains, and waterways. That geography weakened the traditional advantages of Mongol cavalry. The solution was adaptation. By Kublai's era, the armies called Mongol were actually multinational imperial forces. Mongol cavalry remained important, but beside them served northern Chinese troops, Khitans, Jurchens, Central Asians, engineers, infantry, sailors, and eventually large numbers of former Song soldiers. The Mongols had learned a fundamental lesson of empire. If an enemy possessed a useful skill, conquering that enemy could turn the skill into an imperial weapon. The decisive struggle against the Song centered on the fortified cities of Xiangyang and Fanqing. Their position on the Han River made them strategically critical. As long as the Song held them, they blocked a major approach toward the Yangtze Basin. The siege began in 1267. It did not end quickly. For years, the defenders resisted while the Song attempted to move supplies through the river system. Mongol and Yuan forces tightened the blockade and expanded their naval capabilities. Siege engineers became crucial. During the final stages, powerful counterweight trebuchets associated with engineers from the Islamic world were deployed against the defenses. This moment captures the extraordinary geographical reach of Mongol military adaptation. Technology and expertise associated with western regions of the empire were being used in a war for southern China. In 1273, Fanqing fell. Xiangyang surrendered. The defensive gateway had been opened. Kublai placed the experienced commander Bayan at the head of the offensive into the Song heartland. The advance became increasingly difficult to stop. Some Song commanders fought. Others defected. Cities faced a brutal calculation. If the dynasty could no longer protect them, continued resistance might bring destruction without changing the outcome. In 1276, the Mongol armies reached Linnan, modern Hangzhou, the Song capital. Linnan was one of the greatest cities of the medieval world. The city surrendered. The young Song emperor was taken into Mongol custody, but loyalists escaped south with other members of the royal family. Resistance continued for 3 more years. By then, the conflict had become increasingly naval. In 1279, Yuan forces confronted the remaining Song fleet at Yamen. The Song position collapsed. According to Chinese historical tradition, the official Lu Xiufu took the child emperor Zhao Bing and leapt into the sea rather than allow him to be captured. The last organized Song court disappeared with them. After decades of war, Kublai had accomplished something no previous Mongol ruler had achieved. All of China was under his dynasty. He had already declared that dynasty the Yuan in 1271. The name itself made a political statement. Kublai was presenting himself not merely as a Mongol Khan controlling Chinese territory, but as a legitimate emperor within Chinese dynastic tradition. His capital at Dadu stood on the site of modern Beijing. The contrast with the beginnings of the empire could hardly have been greater. Genghis Khan had governed from a mobile imperial household. His grandson now ruled from a designed capital of avenues, walls, palaces, government offices, warehouses, workshops, and markets. Grain traveled north to feed the city. Officials recorded taxes. Astronomers worked at the court. Foreign merchants arrived from distant countries. Imperial documents traveled across a communication network extending through China and toward the wider Mongol world. But Kublai did not simply abandon Mongol traditions and become a conventional Chinese emperor. His government was hybrid. Mongol elites remained politically privileged. Central and Western Asians also held important administrative positions. Chinese institutions continued because ruling China without experienced officials was impossible. The Yuan population was divided into broad administrative categories that reflected the history of conquest. Mongols occupied the highest political position. Various Central and Western Asian peoples, often grouped under the category Simu, also received significant opportunities. Northern Chinese and former subjects of the Jin occupied another category, while inhabitants of the former southern Song territories generally ranked lower. These categories were not an absolutely rigid caste system governing every aspect of life. Yet political inequality was unmistakable. The Mongols had conquered China, and the government reflected the hierarchy of conqueror and conquered. Kublai also adopted aspects of Chinese imperial government. He used Chinese dynastic symbolism. He relied upon bureaucratic ministries. Agricultural taxation became essential. The Grand Canal and associated transport systems were repaired and expanded to move grain toward the capital. Roads and relay stations supported communication. The imperial postal system allowed authorized messengers to obtain horses, food, and accommodations along important routes. This network was one of the practical foundations of Mongol power. A ruler could not govern an empire simply by issuing commands. The commands had to arrive. Kublai's government also made extensive use of paper currency. China had developed paper money before the Mongols, but the Yuan expanded its role. In principle, paper currency simplified commerce across vast distances because merchants did not need to transport enormous quantities of metal. The danger was overissuance. When later Yuan governments printed currency without sufficient fiscal discipline, confidence declined and inflation became increasingly serious. For a time, however, the combination of imperial security, communications infrastructure, and commercial patronage helped create remarkable economic integration. Merchants traveled from Central Asia into China. Chinese products moved west. Persian textiles, precious stones, medicines, spices, horses, metals, ceramics, and luxury goods moved through overlapping trade systems. Mongol elites entered commercial partnerships with merchants, often through arrangements known as ortak partnerships. Trade was not merely tolerated. It could be actively supported by the state. This larger period is sometimes described as the Pax Mongolica. The phrase can be misleading if interpreted literally. There was no universal Mongol peace. The Khanates fought one another. Rebellions occurred. Bandits still threatened travelers. Entire regions continued experiencing war. But political conditions across large portions of Eurasia made long-distance movement easier than it had been during many earlier periods. Merchants were not the only travelers. Diplomats crossed the continent. Missionaries crossed it. Craftsmen moved across it. Some traveled by choice. Others were deported after conquest. The Mongols routinely identified useful specialists among conquered populations and relocated them. A skilled engineer might be sent thousands of kilometers from home. So might an artisan, physician, translator, astronomer, or metalworker. For the empire, this was resource distribution. For the individual force from his family and city, it could be a profound personal catastrophe. Both realities belong to the story. The resulting movement of expertise helped technologies and ideas circulate. The Mongols did not invent gunpowder, printing, paper, the compass, Islamic astronomy, or the sophisticated engineering traditions of China and Middle East. Their importance lay partly in bringing distant societies into more intensive contact. Knowledge traveled with merchants, craftsmen, prisoners, officials, and scholars. Islamic astronomers could work in China. Chinese specialists could sir campaigns far from East Asia. Persian administrators worked for Mongol rulers. Uyghur scribes became important across imperial bureaucracies. Christians from Central Asia occupied positions in Mongol courts. Buddhist teachers interacted with rulers whose armies operated thousands of kilometers away. This cosmopolitan world attracted travelers from Europe. The most famous was Marco Polo. His account describes Kublai's court, Chinese cities, paper money, roads, imperial administration, and the wealth of Asia. Some individual claims in Marco Polo's narrative remain disputed or exaggerated. But European travelers absolutely did reach Mongol courts, and their accounts demonstrate how much geographical knowledge had expanded since the beginning of the century. Kublai's empire was wealthy. It was also restless. The conquest of China did not end his military ambitions. Japan became one of his most famous targets. Kublai sent demands that the Japanese establish relations with his court on terms implying Mongol supremacy. Japan refused to submit. In 1274, an invasion fleet sailed from Korea carrying Mongol, Korean, Chinese, and other troops. The forces attacked Tsushima and Iki before reaching Kyushu. Japanese warriors encountered an enemy accustomed to coordinated formations, mass archery, and weapons that included explosive projectiles. Fighting occurred around Hakata Bay, but the invaders did not establish a permanent position. They withdrew to their ships. Bad weather damaged the fleet, although the first invasion was not simply erased by a single miraculous storm in the way later popular retellings sometimes suggest. Kublai prepared a second attempt. It was vastly larger. By then, he had conquered the southern Song and possessed additional ships, sailors, and manpower. Japan had also prepared. Defensive walls were constructed around sections of Hakata Bay. In 1281, two enormous expeditionary forces sailed toward Japan. Coordination proved difficult. Japanese defenders attacked ships and resisted landings. Then a powerful typhoon struck. Ships were smashed against shorelines or sunk. Thousands of soldiers drowned. Others were killed or captured after reaching land. The invasion collapsed. Japanese tradition remembered the storm as a kamikaze, a divine wind. Kublai had discovered a limit that Genghis Khan had never needed to confront. The sea did not behave like the steppe. The Mongols could recruit sailors and construct fleets, but naval warfare demanded different expertise, and weather could destroy years of preparation in a matter of hours. Other campaigns produced similar lessons. The Yuan repeatedly invaded Dai Viet in what is now northern Vietnam. Mongol forces could capture major cities. Holding them proved much harder. Vietnamese commanders withdrew rather than allowing their armies to be annihilated, attacked supply systems, exploited climate and terrain, and counterattacked when the invaders weakened. Tropical heat and disease placed additional strain on Yuan troops. In 1288, the Vietnamese commander Tran Hung Dao defeated a Yuan fleet on the Bac Dang River after preparing wooden stakes in the riverbed and exploiting tidal conditions. The Mongols withdrew again. Vietnam maintained its independence while accepting diplomatic arrangements that allowed both sides to claim a workable relationship. Campaigns in Burma brought temporary successes, but no permanent conquest of the entire region. Then came Java. Kublai sent an expedition in 1292 after the ruler Kurnagra rejected Yuan demands and reportedly mistreated an envoy. By the time the army arrived, Kurnagra had been killed. A local prince, Raden Wijaya, cooperated with the Yuan forces long enough to defeat his enemies. Then he turned against his Mongol allies. The expedition withdrew. Raden Wijaya established the Majapahit kingdom. The Mongols had crossed the sea to impose imperial authority and instead helped create conditions for the rise of another state. Military failure had financial consequences. Ships cost money. Armies required supplies. Conscripted labor placed pressure on communities. Every unsuccessful expedition consumed resources without providing the tribute or territory expected in return. Kublai's final years became increasingly difficult. His wife Chabi died. His chosen heir, Genghis, died before him. Kublai's health deteriorated. Powerful officials competed for influence. The ruler who had completed the conquest of China now faced a problem more complicated than conquering it. How could the dynasty remain stable after him? Kublai died in 1294. The Yuan dynasty survived, but no later Yuan emperor possessed his combination of prestige, experience, and authority. And beyond China, Mongol political unity was already largely gone. For major Chinggisid realms had emerged. The Yuan dynasty dominated China and Mongolia. The Ilkhanate controlled Iran and surrounding regions. The Chagatai realm occupied much of Central Asia. The Golden Horde ruled the western steppe and exercised overlordship over many Rus principalities. Calling them four perfectly separate countries would oversimplify the situation. Their rulers belonged to one extended dynasty. They traded. They negotiated. They intermarried. Sometimes they cooperated. Sometimes they fought. They still invoked Genghis Khan. But increasingly, each realm was shaped by the civilization it governed. The Ilkhanate provides perhaps the clearest example. Hülegü and his immediate successors ruled a population in which Persian and Islamic traditions were deeply rooted. The early Ilkhans followed different religious traditions and patronized Buddhists, Christians, and Muslims at various times. Then Genghis Khan took power in 1295. Ghazan converted to Islam. The descendants of Mongol conquerors were becoming rulers within the Islamic Persian world. Persian administrators became indispensable. One of the most remarkable was Rashid al-Din. Under Mongol patronage, he helped produce the Jami al-Tawarik, a vast historical work that attempted to record the histories of multiple peoples. Such a project reflected the worldview created by empire. A court in Iran now possessed reason to care about the histories of Mongolia, China, Central Asia, the Islamic world, and distant peoples. Mongol conquest had expanded the geographical imagination of its own subjects. The Ilkhanate never achieved permanent control over Egypt. Conflict with the Mamluks continued. There were attempts at diplomacy with European Christian rulers based on the possibility of joint action against the Mamluks. The imagined alliance never produced a decisive transformation. Eventually, the Ilkhanate's greatest danger came from within. In 1335, Abu Sa'idi died without a suitable male heir capable of commanding consensus. Rival factions raised competing claimants. Military leaders and regional dynasties seized territory. The Ilkhanate fragmented. It had lasted less than a century. But Persian society did not return to the world that existed before Hülegü. Mongol political traditions, elite families, administrative practices, and cultural patronage had become part of the region's history. The Subutai realm followed another path. Central Asia contained both nomadic populations and great sedentary cities. Managing their different interests was extremely difficult. Over generations, Mongol elites increasingly mixed with Turkic populations. Islam spread. Languages shifted. Political identities changed. The Subutai realm eventually divided between western territories around Transoxiana and eastern territories often associated with Mongolistan. Out of the instability of the western region emerged Timur, remembered in Europe as Tamerlane. Timur was a conqueror of extraordinary ability, but he was not a direct male-line descendant of Genghis Khan. That mattered because Chinggisid legitimacy remained immensely powerful. Timur therefore ruled alongside nominal Chinggisid Khans and strengthened his position through marriage into the Chinggisid family. More than a century after Genghis Khan's death, even another world conqueror still found it useful to connect himself to Genghis Khan's dynasty. That is political influence measured not in territory, but in legitimacy. The Golden Horde survived longer. Its territories stretched across the western Eurasian steppe. Its khans controlled important trade routes around the Volga and Black Sea and exercised authority over Rus princes. The Rus principalities were not simply annexed and governed directly by Mongol officials. Many local princes remained in place. They paid tribute. They traveled to the Khan's court to secure recognition. They competed for Mongol support against rivals. This system allowed the horde to extract wealth without administering every settlement. Over time, the Golden Horde became increasingly Turkic in language and Islamic in religion. Under Özbeg Khan in the early 14th century, Islam became firmly established at the ruling court. Sarai developed into a significant city and commercial center. The image of the Golden Horde as nothing but nomads camping outside Russia fails to capture the state it became. There were cities, markets, administrators, diplomats, religious institutions, and international merchants. Meanwhile, one Rus principality was becoming particularly skilled at navigating Mongol politics. Moscow. Moscow's princes competed with rivals, such as Tver, for recognition from the Khans. They collected tribute. They cooperated when cooperation was advantageous. They resisted when circumstances changed. Through this process, Moscow accumulated resources and political influence. In 1380, Grand Prince Dmitry led a coalition against Mamai at the Battle of Kulikovo. The Rus forces won. Later memory transformed the battle into a great milestone of liberation. Its immediate effect was more limited. Mongol authority did not end. In 1382, Toktamish attacked Moscow and burned it. Tribute resumed, but the balance was changing. The Golden Horde suffered internal conflicts. Then Toktamish entered a disastrous struggle with Timur. Timur's campaigns against the Horde in the 1390s inflicted devastating damage. Commercial cities suffered. Political unity weakened. During the following century, separate khanates emerged. Crimea, Kazan, Astrakhan, other Jakut states. In 1480, Ivan III of Moscow confronted Khan Akhmet of the Great Horde along the Yugra River. The confrontation ended with the Horde withdrawing. The event is conventionally treated as the end of Moscow's tributary subordination to the horde. Yet Chinggisid states continued for centuries. Kazan survived until 1552, Astrakhan until 1556. The Crimean Khanate remained a major political power until Russian annexation in 1783. The Mongol imperial state had disappeared long before. Its political descendants had not. China experienced its own transformation. After Kublai, Yuan succession became increasingly unstable. Some emperors ruled effectively. Others occupied the throne briefly. Court factions competed. Powerful ministers accumulated influence. The ruling dynasty faced the problem that every conquest state eventually encounters. The generation that remembered conquest personally was disappearing. Later rulers inherited authority without necessarily inheriting the abilities that had created it. Economic difficulties grew. Paper currency suffered inflation. Taxes and labor demands created resentment. Local corruption reduced confidence in government. Then environmental crises intensified the pressure. The Yellow River flooded repeatedly. Agricultural land was damaged. Communities were displaced. Famine struck some regions. Disease added further suffering. Government efforts to repair hydraulic infrastructure demanded additional labor precisely when many communities were least able to provide it. Rebellion spread. In 1351, major uprisings associated with the Red Turban movements erupted. These revolts were not one centrally coordinated national revolution from the beginning. Different leaders pursued different goals. Religious beliefs, economic desperation, local rivalries, hostility toward officials, and opposition to Yuan government all contributed. One rebel leader eventually surpassed the others. Zhu Yuanzhang. He had been born into an impoverished peasant family. Famine and disease devastated his household. For a period, he lived in a Buddhist monastery. Then he entered the rebellion. Zhu proved to be more than a successful warrior. He understood administration. He secured territory. He defeated rival leaders. He made Nanjing a political base. Over time, his movement became a government. In 1368, Zhu proclaimed the Ming dynasty and became the Hongwu emperor. Ming armies advanced north. The Yuan Emperor Togon Timur abandoned Dadu and withdrew toward Mongolia. Ming troops entered the capital. After less than a century, Mongol rule over China proper ended. But the Yuan did not simply disappear. The Chinggisid court survived in Mongolia and continued claiming imperial legitimacy in what historians call the Northern Yuan. For generations, the Ming faced powerful Mongol groups along their frontier. In 1449, Mongol Oirat forces under Izan defeated a major Ming army at the Temüjin crisis and captured the Ming emperor himself. 2 centuries after Genghis Khan's rise, powers from the Mongolian steppe could still terrify a Chinese dynasty. Mongol history, therefore, did not end in 1368. Nor did Mongol identity dissolve into the civilizations the empire had conquered. In Mongolia itself, Chinggisid descent remained a foundation of political legitimacy. Different Mongol and Oirat powers competed. Tibetan Buddhism later became deeply influential. In 1578, Altan Khan met the Tibetan religious leader Sonam Gyatso and granted him the title Dalai Lama, with the title retrospectively applied to earlier incarnations. The spiritual world of Mongolia changed profoundly over the centuries. Eventually, Most Mongol territories were incorporated into the expanding Qing imperial system. By then, the unified empire of the 13th century belonged to a distant past. Its effects were still visible everywhere. Perhaps the most obvious legacy was destruction. There should be no attempt to hide it behind stories of trade and tolerance. Mongol armies destroyed cities and killed civilians on a massive scale. Parts of Central Asia, northern China, Iran, and Eastern Europe experienced severe demographic and economic disruption. Irrigation networks were damaged in some regions. Populations fled. Craftsmen were forcibly relocated. Agricultural production could collapse during prolonged warfare. The precise numbers of people killed cannot be reconstructed. Medieval chroniclers regularly supplied casualty figures that were exaggerated, symbolic, or simply impossible to verify. Modern claims that the Mongols killed an exact percentage of the world population are likewise not supportable with precision because no reliable global demographic records exist. But uncertainty about numbers does not imply uncertainty about devastation. The destruction was real and enormous. Baghdad was one example. Merv was another. Nishapur another. Cities across northern China and the Rus lands experienced similar catastrophe. For communities caught in these invasions, the Mongol Empire was not an abstract experiment in Eurasian connectivity. It was war. And yet stopping the history, there would also produce a distorted picture. After conquest, the Mongols needed functioning societies. A destroyed city could provide booty once. A productive city could provide taxes for generations. This encouraged a transition from devastation toward administration. The empire developed censuses, tax systems, postal networks, protected trade routes, diplomatic procedures, multilingual bureaucracies. The conquerors learned that sustainable empire required preserving the people who generated its wealth. That shift did not make Mongol government gentle. It made it pragmatic. Religious policy demonstrates this clearly. Genghis Khan and many of his successors generally avoided imposing one universal religion upon conquered peoples. Buddhist monks, Muslim scholars, Christian clergy, Taoists, and practitioners of indigenous traditions could all receive protection. Religious specialists were sometimes exempted from taxation. This tolerance had practical value. Attempting to convert an empire containing many of the world's major religious communities would have produced endless rebellion. But pragmatism was not the only factor. Mongol rulers often displayed genuine interest in competing religious traditions. They invited clerics to court. They asked for prayers. They sought medical and spiritual knowledge. They allowed debates. During Genghis Khan's own lifetime, the Taoist master Qiu Chuji traveled an extraordinary distance to meet him in Central Asia. Genghis reportedly hoped that the Taoist might possess knowledge capable of prolonging life. Qiu Chuji could offer advice about restraint and governance, but no immortality. Genghis Khan died only a few years later. No policy could solve that central problem of empire. Every ruler died. Every death reopened the question of succession. That, more than foreign invasion, was one of the Mongol system's deepest weaknesses. The empire had a royal family, but no fixed principle of automatic inheritance accepted by everyone. A Kuriltai chose the Great Khan. In a smaller state, such consultation could create consensus. Across Eurasia, it became dangerous. Princes might be months away. A prince who feared the likely outcome could refuse to attend. Different factions could convene rival assemblies. Every son, grandson, or branch of the Chinggisid dynasty had followers and expectations. As generations passed, the number of potential competitors multiplied. The empire's own success made consensus harder. Geography made the problem worse. What did a Khan in the Volga region need from an emperor in Beijing? What did a Mongol ruler of Persia gain by allowing his foreign policy to be dictated from China? Why would princes commanding their own armies and collecting their own taxes permanently subordinate themselves to a distant cousin? The emotional authority of Genghis Khan's memory remained powerful. Material interests increasingly pointed in different directions. So the empire fragmented. But fragmentation was not the same as immediate collapse. In some respects, the successor states flourished precisely because they were free to adapt more completely to their regions. The Ilkhans became Persianized and Islamic. The Golden Horde became increasingly Turkic and Muslim. The Chagatai world contributed to the development of later Central Asian Turkic Islamic cultures. The Yuan adopted Chinese imperial practices. The Mongols conquered civilizations, and then those civilizations changed the Mongols. This is one of the most important patterns in the story. Military power could decide who occupied the palace. It could not determine permanently what language the palace bureaucracy would need to use, what taxes the surrounding economy could support, what religion most subjects practiced, or what political traditions offered legitimacy. Conquest transformed the conquered. Government transformed the conqueror. Another Mongol legacy was communication. The Yam relay network became one of the great logistical systems of the medieval world. Authorized messengers could move between stations, replace tire horses, receive food, and continue. Information moved far faster than it could have through an unorganized landscape. This mattered militarily. It mattered economically. It mattered politically. A vast empire lives or dies according to information. A commander needs to know where the enemy is. A governor needs to know what taxes are expected. A ruler needs to know whether a province is rebelling. An ambassador needs a protected route. The Mongols created systems capable of carrying such information across extraordinary distances. Their military organization produced similar advantages. Mongol horsemen typically traveled with multiple mounts. Changing horses allowed rapid movement while reducing exhaustion. Mounted archery permitted attacks without closing into hand-to-hand combat immediately. Feigned retreats exploited enemy impatience. Scouts moved ahead. Separate armies coordinated routes. Commanders were expected to obey an overall plan while exercising initiative. The result was not an uncontrolled horde. It was one of the most disciplined military systems of its age. And once the Mongols encountered technologies they lacked, they incorporated them. Siege warfare was learned. Naval warfare was attempted. Engineers became strategic resources. The army evolved from a steppe force into a multinational imperial institution. This ability to learn explains more about Mongol success than any myth of invincibility. They could be defeated. They were defeated. Einjalit stopped expansion toward Egypt. Japanese resistance and storms defeated Kublai's invasion fleets. Vietnamese armée repeatedly frustrated Yuan occupation. Civil wars consumed Mongol forces. The image of an army that never lost is false. What made the Mongols exceptional was how long they remained capable of adapting after encountering new problems. Their system connected economies as well. The so-called Silk Road had existed for centuries before Genghis Khan. The Mongols did not create it, nor was it one literal road. It was a shifting network of routes connecting cities, oasis communities, markets, ports, and political territories. Mongol rule placed unprecedented stretches of these networks under related governments. For merchants who secured official protection, that could reduce some political risks. Commercial relationships expanded. Black Sea ports connected European merchants with wider Eurasian networks. Central Asian caravans crossed territories associated with different Chinggisid rulers. Maritime trade connected Yuan China with Southeast Asia, India, and the Islamic world. Alongside commodities moved information. Europeans learned more about East Asia. Islamic geographical knowledge interacted with Asian information. Chinese courts gained more direct knowledge of distant Western regions. Artistic styles migrated. Medical ideas traveled. Astronomical observations crossed languages. No one planned a project called globalization. It emerged from the movement created by empire. And the same connection carried danger. During the 14th century, plagues spread across Eurasia. Modern genetic research has strengthened the case for an origin of the pandemic lineage somewhere in central Eurasia, with important evidence associated with the region around Issyk-Kul in the 1330s. From there, disease spread through interconnected commercial systems. By the late 1340s, the Black Death was devastating the Middle East and Europe. The Mongols did not create plague. The pandemic should not be described simply as a Mongol weapon or Mongol invention. But the interconnected Eurasian world of the post-conquest period provided pathways through which disease, like merchants and information, could travel. Connection carried opportunity. Connection also carried death. That duality appears repeatedly in the Mongol story. An imperial road could carry silk or an invading army. A ship could carry porcelain or disease. A transferred engineer could spread technology while living as a captive far from home. Religious tolerance could coexist with political repression. A ruler could spare an entire community after submission and destroy another for resisting. It is tempting to decide whether the Mongol Empire was fundamentally destructive or constructive. History does not require one answer. It was both. Its rulers did not conquer Eurasia to encourage cultural exchange. They conquered for power, security, wealth, prestige, dynastic ambition, and the political worldview of universal sovereignty that developed around Genghis Khan's house. Exchange followed because conquest created connections. Likewise, the Mongols did not massacre populations because they lacked organization. In many campaigns, terror was part of organization. A city known to have resisted and suffered destruction could become a warning to the next city. Fear reduced the number of sieges the Mongols needed to fight. It was strategically effective precisely because the threat was credible. That is an uncomfortable but necessary distinction. Violence could be rational without being less horrifying. Genghis Khan himself embodies the difficulty of simple judgment. In Mongolia, he can be remembered as the founder who unified the people and established political independence on an unprecedented scale. In regions devastated by his armies, his name has a very different historical resonance. Both memories originate in real experiences. For his followers, Genghis Khan ended generations of destructive tribal rivalry and opened extraordinary opportunities. For many whom he conquered, he brought catastrophe. The same historical person can occupy opposite positions in different historical memories. Modern mythology adds further complications. One often repeated claim says that a huge share of men in Asia are directly descended from Genghis Khan. Genetic research has identified a widely distributed Y chromosome lineage that expanded rapidly around the period of the Mongol Empire. Researchers suggested that it may have been associated with a powerful male lineage in the Mongol world. But without verified DNA from Genghis Khan or his close male relatives, the lineage cannot be assigned to him personally with certainty. The broader conclusion remains remarkable. Political power can leave biological consequences across centuries. Yet, Genghis Khan's political descendants are much easier to identify than his genetic descendants. For hundreds of years, rulers across Central Asia sought Chinggisid legitimacy. Some claimed direct descent. Others married Chinggisid women. Still others ruled through puppet khans because only a descendant of Genghis Khan was considered entitled to hold the title. The empire had vanished. Its idea of legitimate rule survived. Even Timur, one of history's greatest conquerors, could not simply ignore it. That may be a more meaningful inheritance than DNA. The empire's final lesson lies in the contradiction between conquest and government. Mongol armies could cross enormous distances rapidly. Administration could not move at the same speed. A city could be taken in days or months. Integrating millions of inhabitants required years. Military discipline could compel soldiers to follow orders. It could not guarantee that distant princes would remain politically subordinate forever. The larger the empire grew, the greater its resources became. But every new territory also created another administrative burden. Another frontier, another group of elites, another set of religious and cultural traditions, another ambitious prince, another communication problem. The Mongols eventually reached the point where further conquest increased complexity faster than central authority could manage it. Their greatest achievement created their greatest weakness. The empire had become too successful to remain the political structure founded in 1206. When Genghis Khan unified the Mongolian plateau, the people beneath him shared a broadly compatible military environment. When Kublai claimed universal authority half a century later, his relatives were governing Chinese farmers, Persian cities, Russian principalities, Muslim merchants, Turkic nomads, Caucasian Christians, and Central Asian oasis communities. There was no single administrative system ideally suited to all of them. Regional adaptation was unavoidable. Regional adaptation produced regional interests. Regional interests produced political independence. The Mongol Empire, therefore, did not experience one final collapse. It changed form. The Great Khan lost effective authority over distant relatives. The relatives became sovereign rulers. Their states adopted local cultures. Those states fragmented. Their successor states fragmented again. Eventually, Genghis Khan's empire ceased to exist politically while pieces of its inheritance remained embedded across Eurasia. By then, the world had changed. Baghdad was no longer the seat of the Abbasid Caliphate. China had experienced the first dynasty ruling the whole country from a Mongol imperial house. The Rus lands had endured centuries of Jochid supremacy. Persia had absorbed a Mongol dynasty into its Islamic culture. Central Asia had become the center of new Turkic Mongol political formations. Europe possessed far greater knowledge of Asia than it had before the 13th century. Commercial systems had expanded. Technologies had circulated. And generations of people had been displaced, killed, incorporated, or connected by the most rapid continental conquest of the medieval world. The Mongol achievement looks even more extraordinary when we return to its beginning. There had been no great imperial capital, no enormous trisuri, no navy, no ancient centralized bureaucracy belonging to the Mongols. There had been Temüjin, Hülegü, a struggling family, a network of companions, alliances that could fail, rivals more powerful than Temüjin, a political world in which defeat could mean disappearance. From that environment came a ruler who understood something fundamental about power on the steppe. People mattered more than fixed territory. A leader with loyal followers could lose pasture and recover. A leader who lost his followers had nothing. Temüjin therefore built relationships of loyalty with unusual intensity. He rewarded service. He elevated capable men. He reorganized defeated groups. He broke some old aristocratic networks. He constructed military units whose members owed obligations beyond their original tribal identities. Then he used those institutions to turn the resources of conquered enemies into the instruments of the next conquest. That cycle changed history. Mongol horses defeated armies. Chinese engineers helped capture Central Asian cities. Central Asian and Persian specialists later served Mongol governments. Naval forces built from conquered populations helped complete the conquest of southern China. An empire created by pastoral nomads eventually commanded technologies and expertise drawn from the whole breadth of Eurasia. That was the true Mongol military machine, not merely bows and horses. An organization that learned, an empire that absorbed, a dynasty that turned conquered resources outward until there were few directions left in which it could expand. Then it turned inward. The civil wars did what foreign armies had struggled to accomplish. They divided the descendants of Genghis Khan against one another. And once that happened, no later great Khan could fully reverse it. The unified empire was temporary. The consequences were not. Today, the boundaries of Eurasia no longer resemble the Mongol imperial map. The cities once conquered belong to different nations. Languages have changed. Religions have shifted. Dynasties have vanished. Yet traces remain. Beijing's rise as a major imperial capital owes an important chapter to Kublai's Dadu. The political development of Moscow unfolded partly within and against the world of the Golden Horde. Persian historiography and art were transformed during Ilkhanid rule. Central Asian concepts of kingship carried Chinggisid legitimacy for centuries. Mongolian national identity still places Genghis Khan at the center of its historical memory. Even debates about globalization, military adaptation, religious tolerance, imperial violence, and state formation repeatedly return to the Mongol example. And perhaps the strangest thing about the entire story is that the man at its center left no known monumental tomb. Genghis Khan's burial place has never been conclusively found. Tradition points toward the sacred landscape of the Kenai Mountains and Burkhan Khaldun. Legends surround the burial. Stories claim witnesses were killed to conceal the location. Others describe elaborate methods of hiding the grave. None can be accepted confidently as historical fact. What remains certain is simpler. Somewhere after the campaign of 1227, the body of the founder disappeared from historical view. There is no pyramid, no marble mausoleum securely identified with him, no enormous surviving statue erected during his lifetime. The empire became his monument, and even that monument disappeared politically. But unlike stone, its consequences could move. They moved with armies. They moved with merchants. They moved with refugees and prisoners. They moved through marriages and religious conversions. They moved in manuscripts translated between languages. They moved through technologies carried from one court to another. They moved through stories told by people who had seen Mongol riders arrive from beyond the horizon. Centuries later, those consequences remained. That is why the Mongol Empire cannot be understood simply by measuring its territory. A map can show where armies reached. It cannot show what happened afterward. It cannot show the artisan taken from one ruined city and placed in another imperial workshop thousands of kilometers away. It cannot show the merchant discovering that one set of political connections could now take him farther across Eurasia. It cannot show a Russian prince waiting at a Khan's court for permission to govern. It cannot show Persian administrators teaching conquerors how to tax an agricultural state. It cannot show Kublai discovering that ruling China demanded different institutions from ruling Mongolia. It cannot show a Japanese defender watching unfamiliar ships appear offshore. It cannot show a Baghdad family facing an army assembled from peoples they had never encountered. Those experiences were the empire. Its history is therefore not only the history of the Khans. It belongs equally to the millions of people whose lives changed because the Khans existed. For some, the change offered opportunity. For many others, it brought suffering. For nearly everyone caught inside its expansion, it made isolation more difficult. The Mongols forced distant histories into the same story. China and Persia became politically connected through one dynasty. The Rus principalities became entangled with the western steppe. European courts sent missions toward Mongolia. Armenian rulers negotiated within a Mongol-dominated Middle East. Muslim administrators worked for Buddhist or shamanist rulers. Christian queens existed inside Chinggisid dynasties. The geographical categories that make medieval history appear like separate regional stories suddenly overlapped. That may be the empire's greatest historical significance. Not that it created one permanent Eurasian civilization. It did not. Not that it erased cultural differences. It did not. It demonstrated how suddenly those different worlds could become entangled. Then, the political structure producing that entanglement broke apart. The Yuan fell from China. The Ilkhanate fragmented. The Chagatai realm divided. The Golden Horde weakened and produced successor khanates. No final Mongol emperor watched all of it happen. There was no single last battle. The empire died by becoming other things. And those other things continued changing history. An empire born through mobility had ended through transformation. Perhaps there could have been no more appropriate ending. The world of Temüjin had never been static. Families moved with their herds. Political alliances shifted. Followers changed leaders. Confederations formed and dissolved. Power belonged to whoever could keep people together. Genghis Khan succeeded because, for one extraordinary period, he held more of that world together than anyone before him. His descendants pushed the system until it encompassed societies unimaginably larger than the one from which it had begun. Then those societies pulled the empire in different directions. China pulled Kublai toward Chinese emperorship. Persia pulled the Khans toward Persian and Islamic government. The western steppe shaped the Golden Horde. Central Asia transformed the Chagatays. Conquerors became inhabitants. Outsiders became dynasties. Mongol Empire became Chinese, Persian, Turkic, Islamic, and Eurasian history simultaneously. So when the question is asked why the Mongol Empire fell, there is no single answer. Succession disputes mattered. Civil wars mattered. Distance mattered. Regional cultures mattered. Economic pressures mattered. Resistance mattered. Environmental crises mattered in some regions. The enormous scale of the empire mattered most of all because it magnified every other problem. Conquest had solved fragmentation on the Mongolian plateau. It created a vastly larger fragmentation across Eurasia. And yet, judging the empire only by the fact that it eventually divided would miss what every empire eventually proves. Political unity is temporary. Consequences are not. Rome fragmented. The caliphates fragmented. Chinese dynasties rose and fell. The Mongol Empire belonged to the same historical reality. Its extraordinary feature was how quickly it reached continental scale before encountering that reality. A little more than half a century separated the Kuriltai of 1206 from the civil war between Kublai and Ögedei. Within one long human lifetime, the Mongols went from competing steppe groups to rulers of a system extending across most of Eurasia. Another few generations transformed that system into regional states. The speed is almost more astonishing than the size. In 1206, Genghis Khan looked outward for Mongolia. In 1227, he died having conquered enormous territories but leaving much unfinished. In 1234, his successors eliminated the gene. In 1241, Mongol armies defeated European forces in Poland and Hungary. In 1258, Baghdad fell. In 1260, the ruling family entered a decisive civil war. In 1279, Kublai completed the conquest of southern Song China. In 1294, Kublai died. In 1335, the Ilkhanate began disintegrating. In 1368, the Yuan lost China. By the end of the 14th century, the unified empire survived mainly as ancestry, political tradition, and memory. But what a memory it was! A family once abandoned after the death of its patriarch had produced rulers from China to the Black Sea. A people without a major sedentary city of their own had captured some of the greatest cities on earth. An army associated with horses and bows had learned siege warfare, engineering, administration, naval operations, taxation, diplomacy, and international commerce. The Mongols had not been unstoppable. They had been adaptable. They had not been uniquely savage compared with some imagined peaceful medieval world. But the scale and strategic use of their violence were extraordinary. They had not been modern champions of multiculturalism, but their pragmatic management of religious and cultural diversity was striking. They had not invented global trade, but they intensified connections across an enormous part of the old world. They did not permanently unite Eurasia, but they changed what Eurasian connection could look like. Those distinctions matter because the real history is more remarkable than either myth. There is no need to exaggerate casualty figures. The destruction was already immense. There is no need to invent supernatural military abilities. Their organization was impressive enough. There is no need to pretend they created every technology that crossed continents. Their role in accelerating exchange was consequential enough. There is no need to portray Genghis Khan as either a monster without political intelligence or a misunderstood humanitarian. He was a 13th century conqueror whose capacity for institution building existed alongside extreme violence. The empire reflects the same combination. Creation and destruction were not separate chapters. They occurred together. A city could burn while its craftsmen were selected for imperial service. A defeated population could lose independence while its administrators entered the conquering government. A trade route could become safer because an army had violently eliminated competing powers along it. The empire connected Eurasia through methods that often devastated the people being connected. That paradox cannot be removed without turning history into propaganda. The Mongol Empire deserves neither romanticization nor caricature. It deserves to be understood. And once it is understood, its scale becomes difficult to forget. It began with survival. Then came unity. Then conquest. Then empire. Then adaptation. Then division. And finally transformation. The Mongol riders disappeared from many of the lands they had conquered. Their descendants did not always continue calling themselves Mongols. Some became Muslim rulers. Some became culturally Persian. Some became Turkic-speaking. Some ruled China according to institutions their ancestors had once attacked from beyond its frontier. Others returned to Mongolia and continued competing beneath the prestige of Genghis Khan's name. But none could reverse what had happened. The worlds of East Asia, Central Asia, the Islamic Middle East, the Caucasus, and Eastern Europe had been brought into sustained political contact. The consequences survived the empire that created them. And somewhere beneath the earth of Mongolia, the burial place of Temüjin remains unknown. The child who had once possessed almost nothing died, commanding an empire whose successors would rule millions. He left no known grave for later emperors to display. Perhaps that is fitting. His story was never ultimately about one location. It was about movement, from the Onan River to northern China, from Mongolia to Samarkand, from Central Asia to the Caucasus, from the steppe to Kiev, from the Volga toward Hungary, from Iran to Baghdad, from northern China to the southern coast, from the Mongolian grasslands into the histories of dozens of modern countries. The political empire eventually stopped moving as one. Its influence did not. That is why, more than 8 centuries later, the Mongol Empire remains one of the central events in global history. Not because it was the largest empire ever in every possible measurement, but because it created the largest contiguous land empire and placed an unprecedented stretch of Eurasia inside one interconnected political world. Not because its rulers were invincible, but because they repeatedly adapted after discovering their limitations. Not because their government was universally tolerant or prosperous, but because a nomadic imperial elite learned to govern radically different civilizations without demanding that all of them become culturally Mongol. And not because the empire lasted forever. It did not. Its significance lies partly in how short the period of unified supremacy actually was compared with the magnitude of its consequences. The empire that had taken decades to conquer took generations to fragment. Its effects took centuries to unfold. Moscow continued rising. Persian culture continued developing. China continued responding to the political consequences of Mongol rule. Central Asian rulers continued invoking Genghis Khan. Merchants continued using routes shaped during the imperial period. Successor khanates continued fighting and trading long after the great Khan had ceased to command them. This was the final victory of the Mongol Empire, although no Mongol ruler planned it. It became impossible to remove from history. The armies could leave. The dynasty could fall. The empire could disappear from maps. The encounters it had created could never be reversed. Once China and Persia had been connected through imperial administration, that connection became part of their history. Once European envoys had crossed Asia and returned with information, Europe knew that world differently. Once Mongol political institutions had shaped the western steppe and Rus, later states developed within the conditions they left behind. Once generations of Central Asian rulers had accepted Chinggisid descent as a source of legitimacy, Genghis Khan no longer needed a living empire for his name to carry political power. That is what survived. Not one government, not one army, not even one culture. A changed Eurasia. The empire began beneath the eternal blue sky with a ruler whose followers believed heaven had granted him extraordinary authority. It ended under many skies, among people speaking different languages and worshiping according to different traditions. In between, it altered the course of continents. The Mongols conquered farther than the political system that created them could permanently govern. They connected societies that had never before existed beneath such closely related rulers. Then they became part of those societies. Their unified empire died. Their history did not. And in that sense, the story that began with Temüjin on the Mongolian steppe never had a clean ending. It flowed outward into the histories of China, Mongolia, Korea, Central Asia, Iran, the Middle East, the Caucasus, Russia, and Europe. The borders disappeared. The consequences remained. That was the Mongol Empire, born from division, built by conquest, sustained by organization, transformed by the civilizations it ruled, broken by distance and dynasty, and remembered because, for one extraordinary period in human history, riders from the Mongolian steppe forced almost the entire breadth of Eurasia into the same story.